Hey everyone, this is Mark Grasse, and this is Podcast Mark, where I talk to leaders, marketers, business owners, and basically everybody. I think I'm going to have my son on the show at some point. So today
Fantastic.
we're talking to Thomas von Ahn. He's actually one of my kind of digital marketer community. He does a ton with digital marketing. Has had several successful agencies. Actually, has it been several, or did you have the one? Because I know whenever I talk to him, I'm always astounded with how long
Well,
he.
I've spent a lot of time in sales and marketing, over 40 years worth. Had an
Wow.
agency for about 14. Yeah, that just means I'm really old.
No, it does. Experienced.
Had an agency for 14 years, left it, and now we're working on building a consulting side and kind of dabbling and phasing into the sunset and having fun.
Hey, you know what? I think you picked the perfect time because I think everything is changing right now, and
Yeah.
it's so crazy because we always talk in terms of marketing and business, but it's literally almost every aspect of life. I think is kind of reached a change point. So, I think it's a good time because I wanted to have you on to kind of talk about leadership, talk about how it kind of applies to fatherhood, and how it applies to, crazy changing times,
Yeah.
uh, which is what we're dealing with. So let's start with, kind of how you define a leader and kind of how you have applied it to both fatherhood and, your businesses.
When it goes into this subject, one of my favorite quotes is from Sir Richard Branson.
Mm,
And he talks about that you should be training people. Now, this can be employees, this can be your children,
mm,
okay? Well enough so they can leave. That could be leave the nest, leave mom and dad, okay? That can mean leave your business.
mm,
You've trained and developed them. But the other side of that is that he says, but treat them so well that they don't want to.
mm,
Okay. In other words, the child wants to come back home and visit. Hey, mom and dad, how you doing? Or still continues to chat with you every day with the tools that we have today. And in business, that means, hey, thank you, but I'm going to go out and do something else on my own. And we as leaders, we should be proud of that and happy for it. Some leaders, though, take a look at what Sir Richard Branson says, and they see that as a threat. Okay. Now, that doesn't make them a bad owner, leader, entrepreneur, whatever. But this issue kind of gets into family raising styles of leadership too, does it not?
Oh, completely. I love that quote because it's a difficult thing to realize because it is easy as a manager or as a business owner to get really offended when you've taken somebody who didn't really know very much and you train them
Yeah.
a ton, and
Yeah.
then but I think having a positive attitude towards it means that you'll be happy if they could find a job that pays twice as much or whatever. And for
Mhm.
kids, I don't know, being more proud of somebody who could go from not ever living on their own to supporting themselves. I mean, that's a huge achievement. But again, there are parents who get sad.
Absolutely. Um, I can remember becoming an empty nester,
Mm,
and my wife and I of 40 years, we're sad. Mostly because, like you, I see in social media, you and I are very involved in our children's lives. I mean, in the agency I built, my kids worked there. Still, two of them
oh
still
wow.
work. Okay. Um, and so developing that environment, that culture for your children and for your employees, it can be tough. It can feel like you've been left, you
Mhm.
know, and you kind of have to redevelop yourself, kind of like in the world of AI for agencies. Boy, you have to kind of refine yourself. You have these new tools. You have to, wow, that might mean I have to get rid of employees and reduce my costs. That Modern tools will enable you and I as a dad. I mean, I have a son who lives in Austin, Texas, where your offices are. And I talk to him every single day
Wow.
during through COVID, during good times, during bad, during dad advice, even, hey son, what would you do in this spot? So as being a dad and being a leader, I think a lot of those characteristics
Oh,
cross paths, don't they?
oh, absolutely. I think I've actually caught myself before being like, I need to stop talking to this person like they're a child of mine. Because
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
had that where I'm like, do I sound like a dad right now? Because I feel like I'm having to sit down with my son to talk about something that's not going right. And
So our that reminds me, our house when the kids were young, like I was their soccer coach, no, we're gonna have my dad coach. But we were the house that those children that you knew were in, a broken home,
mm,
uh, single mom, but she's working two jobs, um, that type of thing. We were that house they wanted to come to. And there was a time where my wife and I, by other parents, were like, well, they must want to come there because they can do anything.
uh,
And this was where, in my young parenting days, I learned that kids actually want structure, discipline, a safe place to be. They didn't get away with everything.
oh man, well, my wife and I talk about that all the time because of the parent groups that we're in. We're like the strict parents because
Yeah.
well, one of the conversations we have constantly is about the cell phone because my son, I have a 10 and 11 year
Okay.
old, and
Yeah.
my 11-year old's autistic, so he's a different set.
Sure.
But my 10-year old, we told him, we said, hey, if you will not bug us about getting a cell phone until you're 16, we'll literally buy you a car because we just see all these. I mean, it could be a whole generation raised by cell phone. We used to say, oh, generation raised by TV. And I'm like, no, this is way worse because it's interactive. And these kids, what we actually notice, and we always remind our son of this, is like, hey, son, you know how you always want to do stuff and you're always doing
Yeah.
art. And when you get bored, you go outside and you play
Yeah.
outside.
Yeah.
Like, what happens when you go over to your friend's house and they have a phone or an iPad? He's like, it's just boring. Like, we just sit there and nothing
Yeah.
happens. And I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes. And on top of the fact that, just the discipline side where it's like, hey, I don't like beating you up on stuff, and not literally beating you up, but be mad at you for things. Like, it's not pleasant for me, and it's not pleasant for you to criticize an employee either. But it's like, if I don't do this, if I just say it's fine, I'll make it up for you, you're not learning anything. I'm increasingly frustrated, and we have a much less productive relationship. So I think that completely applies.
That reminds me of, I know you're like me, you read a lot, right? Um, Always trying to improve yourself. Um, and when it comes to being a business leader and managing people, just like raising your children, um, there's certain characteristics that I think cross over. And one you mentioned, it reminds me of courage.
Mm.
Okay. Um, Courage as a leader can mean that you have the courage to pursue a new challenge. It can also mean that you're accepting of responsibilities, pushing yourself to gain new skills, and from a parenting side, having the courage to tell your child no.
It's that
Because,
easy.
yeah, well, who is a leader of people or as a dad, mom, doesn't want to be cool and you don't want to be disliked, but that you have to set some guidelines and you have to have the courage to do that.
Enforce them, right? Well, that's really where I think a lot of people fail, or they just don't realize that's part of the process. Like, and it's not fun. I think people think like, well, I'll
No,
be
it's
my
not.
kid's buddy. or I'll be my employee's
Yeah.
buddy. And
Right.
then they'll like me, they'll do their job and do what they're supposed to because they're going to appreciate that I treat them like that. And it's like, no, no, they don't understand the situation. And the dynamic isn't a friend dynamic that you have.
Right.
Like you're
Right.
supposed to
But it
lead, you're
can look
supposed
like
to
that.
train. It
Yeah.
can. Yeah, well,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be horrible,
Right. Right.
but
Right.
any good relationship. If you, I don't know anybody who's had like a significant other, and it's like we literally never fought, and the whole thing was
Right.
fantastic, and there were
Right.
no problems, and it was
Right.
just like magic. And I'm like, I've never had a
Yep.
situation like that ever with
Yep.
anybody.
Yep.
And now, actually, you know what's funny is I look at the relationships I have, and I'm like, you know what? If you're never disagreeing with a person that you're, having any form of relationship with, you're probably one or both of you are not being completely honest,
Right.
anyways.
Right.
So it's
Right.
not real.
They talk about, I think one of the recent courses I took on leadership and trying to decide where things are changing with that,
Mm,
and um, talked about decision making capabilities. And here's another quality that a good leader in a business has to have, and so does mom and dad.
yep.
Um, you have to be able to see futuristic. You have to have a vision. You have to have the ability to make right decisions at the right time. Now, the audience goes, well, what's considered right? Because then that boils down into all of our morals and ethics and differences. And, my goodness, all you have to do is look into politics today to see
Mm,
how much people uh, differ there. But I think we're talking about also teaching your child, hey, this is how mom and dad make decisions.
mm,
And this is the decision we're making with you. Just like with employees, I've promoted some that were less senior in the business than others,
that's hard.
but it's because they had a college degree and the other one didn't. No, it's because they had decision making capabilities and the other person was very passive.
Mm,
So, we as business leaders, as you're growing and scaling up, and say you're going from a mom and pop shop to a dozen employees to 50 to 100 employees, you guys always teach systems, responsibility, um, having certain methodologies that you always follow.
mm.
And our kids are always watching us doing those things, right?
Oh, and they remember. I'll tell you that much. My son never forgets crap unless it's convenient for him to. But most of the time it's like, yeah, but I think what you're talking about is earning the spot and then showing, what being in that spot means, and then exemplifying all the things that you're telling them to do. Because I think there's, one of the worst traits you can have as a leader is inconsistency and not following your own rules, not living up to the standards that you're trying to make other people live up to. So as a parent, I think it's even more difficult because you had to go from, hey, when I'm at home I could act however I want and I could just be me or whatever, and now it's like you don't even have that when you become a parent, because now when you're in the home you got to exemplify, like it's not just you anymore, it's like you are training another person to live. And their success or failure is really, really dependent on you doing a good job. And so it's high stakes and it's personal, and it still follows a lot of the same principles as being a manager. You're setting
Bingo.
principles.
Bingo.
Yes, exactly.
So let's take the flip side of that. Um, Something I thought of while you were talking for dad, mom, leaders, so on and so forth, is failure.
Mm. Oh, that's a great one.
I have failed in my life, and my children know it, and it is very openly discussed. I'm so open about it that my kids as adults will say, Dad, that's over, that's old. Stop talking about it. Okay. But we as parents and we as leaders, when it comes to success and failure, I personally use failure as a way to learn and grow because success is a horrible teacher.
Mm,
Failure is a great teacher. Um, but it's also how I use failure to try to keep myself humble,
mm.
which is an attribute I'm not very good at.
Well, people always say that, oh, well, I'm so humble and I'm quiet and I'm blah, blah, blah. I'm like, a lot of successful people I know aren't because people don't think you're successful unless you act successful. And it's kind of a self-feeding loop. So, and same thing with management or leadership. It is, even those kind of abstract or maybe they seem shallow, those traits of like, well, oh well, you talking about your success that you had and talking about your failure, of course, is the other side of that coin, and you definitely have to do that. But if you are too humble, it could actually be a barrier, and it's not
I agree
real.
with that. Yeah. And that's the way I see it. Yeah.
Well, do you have those
How
people
do
that are
you
too
how do you
humble?
handle failure with your children?
Oh, well, we talk about it because my son, Declan, he's a perfectionist. Like
You
he
failed at something?
Oh no, he fails and stuff all the time, but he gets super
No,
down on him.
you have you.
Oh, me. Oh, yes. Yeah, just massive failures. And I talk about that fairly often actually. Like,
Cool.
but they're much better teachers. I always say like it wasn't really a failure because if I hadn't done that thing that didn't go very well 10 years ago, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
pretty good today. So it was just part of the process, just part of the path. And it's a learning lesson. And you have those, and you'll see it in professional athletes sometimes where they just have always won. And you're like, man, if this guy fails at this point, that could break him. And then he might just quit after that. You don't
Hmm.
know
Hmm.
how much it can affect you. So
Hmm.
it's necessary to learn, to talk about failure because otherwise your kids do have this perfection of you talking. Same thing with your employees. They'd be like, he never screws
So,
up.
so with employees and talking about failure, um, for a long time I had a business partner and um I've had employees who they were struggling. And it was because of their decisions, or they were single moms and had a boatload of responsibility, or some bad relationships, whatever it was. We've all had those employees, right?
Yep.
So one of the characteristics of a great leader is empathy and caring for those. Now, in thinking of scenarios, um, maybe your child um, made a mistake, you talked it out. What did you do to teach them? Well, the infamous, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. And so that's grounding and, go to your room and,
Mm.
now you have to eat all your green beans or whatever. Okay. With an employee, um, I've helped them out financially on the side with my own money.
Mm. Wow.
And there are some leadership styles that see that action as a big negative.
Huh.
Have you ever had any situation like that, or how did
Oh
you
yeah.
handle it if so?
Well, for the helping employees outside of the business with something that was more personal. Yeah, I mean, well, the funny thing is, like with my employees that I've had and the ones that have left and done a good job, is they never really go away. It's just like you're still talking to them, you'll
Right,
still
right,
give them jobs and
right.
referrals and support as much as you can outside of that because you want them to succeed. And I think that's that's really the trait of the good leader is I don't care where you go. I just hope you are happy and are progressing because that's the only thing that matters. And the progressing is a big important part of it because sometimes I'll look at people and maybe they're doing okay. They'll be like, they've been in the same spot for 10 years. I can't even picture that. Like, I can't picture a year most of the time. Uh, so, but to each their own. But yeah, I think supporting them and just supporting them as people. I think that's the biggest thing I've learned over probably the recent years is just treat everybody like a person. Like don't uh, put them into some box because they're this type of employee or they're this type of other person you're interacting with. It's like no, just people. Just treat them like people.
Mhm,
It's like,
mhm, mhm.
and then it tends to work out. Like stop qualifying your behavior because of the type of person you're dealing with, and you'll find that it's much more consistent. But you need the base. So let's just talk about the basics of like what would you say are the top three kind of principles that apply to both fatherhood and leadership in a business aspect?
Being transparent,
Transparency, I like that.
um, being confident.
Mm,
I think your children and your employees look to you to set the vision, their plan, and they need you to be confident about what you foresee changes being or direction we're going or why we're doing what we're doing. Okay. Then they need to be able to trust you. But the flip of that, to me anyway, is that humility comes into play when maybe you made a choice or a decision that wasn't quite right. Because maybe you're growing and teaching your child and your employee to be something, do something. Maybe that's to make you money as a business owner. Maybe that's to handle your client correctly the way you would. But they also need to know that when they fail, when they made a decision or a choice based upon what they were taught, but it didn't go right, that they need to know they can come to you with that.
mm,
I've seen many parents and many leaders, and I've done this myself early on in being a dad, where I couldn't show my failure.
mm,
And so that struck into not being able to be humble. And then they know better. They see things. Your employees see things, your children see things, and then they instantly know, hey, he's not being real straight with me.
mm.
So to me, all of these things wrap in around confidence and humility and then trust. So
Yes.
those three things, I think a person you have to work on those all the time, have them polished and nailed down. I think we as dads and business leaders, we don't realize how much we're being watched.
Oh yeah. Oh, or even how much impact you have because of that.
Yeah.
Everybody observing you all the time. Like you might, like you said, you might think you're getting away with something, or that, oh, I
Yep.
pulled the wool over everybody's eyes on this one.
Yep.
I did a terrible job. It's like, nah, you didn't. And they might be placating you because they like you enough to do that.
Yep.
But it's a careful balance because I completely agree about the confidence because there's nothing worse in a bad situation than having a leader that's also down because that's the time that you got to raise up and be like, hey, no, that went crummy, but we got more planned and we got all this energy left and we got all these things going for us. So we're not going
Yep.
to dwell on that thing that happened. And yeah, we didn't do a good job, but we're going to move forward and it's going to be better. And that's a hard thing to do because the thing you want to do inside your head is like just curl into a ball and cry or rage and just be super angry. And it's like, no, you can't do either one of those things because you're the guy or the girl and you need to stand up and pretend for everybody's benefit because I've always said that the best leaders are usually reluctant ones. They're the ones that are accepting leadership as a responsibility rather than as a a
Ooh, I like that
desirable
a lot.
thing.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I've never wanted to be a leader per se. I've always there's always a thing like, oh, you want to be a leader and not a follower. I'm like,
But
if somebody knows more than
have you
me.
ever worked for a bad leader?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Were they bad because they're different style than you, or what made them bad? Because there's what, half a dozen different styles of leadership?
Oh, there's probably millions of different, yeah, thousands of different styles of leadership. Yeah, well, I think the thing you see the most is somebody who's just not keeping their word, or you just say like they said this was going to go, and it didn't work out, and they're not owning up to it. No, worse than not owning up to it, they're making excuses and they're blaming other people, and that's a bad leader. They're ineffective and they're not using failure to push the movement forward. They're just pretending it didn't exist or it wasn't their fault, so they're not accepting responsibility for it.
Okay.
So no, don't do that.
What about what about the leader or the parent that doesn't make themselves available? You always
Oh,
hear this open door policy or whatever, but maybe they're not available because they aren't there, but they're on boards and committees and meetings, or the business has gotten so big that the next layer of management and leadership hasn't been empowered,
mm,
developed, trained well enough, just kind of given a title, so to speak. Okay. Um, and as a parent, um, I'm going to think of one of my now adult daughters.
so if she
Uh,
listens to this.
I love her dearly. She knows it. One day she came into my home as an adult, married, so on and so forth. Sit down. I got issues with you.
I
Okay.
respect that.
Legal pad.
Really, like literally.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And she wasn't wrong. And I think us as leaders and parents, especially as your children become adults and we've developed them and they're out in the world, that they start looking back on things that we've done and made as decisions, that they're like, wait a minute, why did my dad do that?
Mm,
You know, or hey, you have a thought process here that's way different than my generation. And that can happen as a parent, that can happen as a leader. In my previous agency, I'm 63 right now. Most of my employees are Gen Zs, millennials at the oldest,
mhm.
and their values and the way they view society and the way they view responsibilities of a community are very different than my baby boomer generation.
Oh yeah. Well, even the money motivation.
Yep, yep. Um, and that can develop into where, as you get older, there are differences with your children. So I've been thinking about our talk and all of these leadership characteristics. They cross over also in developing your children.
No. Well, and the thing is, it's kind of funny because I think like people think that being a parent should be natural. Like, oh no, I'll just do what I'll flow with
And they
the.
teach you how to do it.
Yeah, well, it's like we really should be taught how to do this. Like, it's a very important thing that you have this structure, that you sit down and make decisions on how you're going to handle situations if and when they come up. Because if you are a parent, especially with teenagers, because I briefly, raised my nephew for like a year and a half, and he was 13,
Mhm.
and I was completely different than,
Yeah.
my kids who were 9 and 10 at the time. And it's not natural. And you do have to sit down just like you do with a business plan and say, here's the mission, here's what we do in this family, and here's how we handle these things. And if this happens, then this is what we do. And it's all procedural. So that's why I
Yeah.
always say it's sort of the same job. And honestly, you should love your employees ideally, right? These are people that
Right.
you might be with more than your family. That's not unusual.
Um, so another characteristics that leadership versus being a dad. We just talked about you have to be that open door, being able to come in and let's talk about a hard subject, what my daughter did with me. But is also about who is it that you attract
Mm,
and why do you attract those people? And I look at who my children dated
mm,
successfully and how they got out of certain relationships, what ones worked, what ones did not. Um, I look at employees that I'm sure just like me, there's been some you've had to terminate. And that termination of relationships, um, I can't think of anybody I've ever terminated that we didn't stay in touch.
mm,
And to me, that's a characteristic of a parent and a characteristic of a leader in that, hey, maybe a certain scenario didn't work out, but that doesn't mean either of us are a bad person. Wasn't the right environment, right?
mhm,
And as a leader, I mean that takes guts to be able to do that and to know that oftentimes when you're terminating somebody, to me, if you do it right, they know it's coming.
mhm.
They're not surprised. I mean, unless all of a sudden it's this massive layoff because you just lost an account that was
Yeah,
40% of your business. Okay, there's
different
a
situation.
but just like with your children, I've seen my children date people who I'm like,
Well, the thing is, you can't change that. Like
no,
you're not. Well, I think that's what I've realized more as a parent and kind of business leader is that I could only control what I do, and that's it. You could try to influence people and encourage them and whatever you want, but at the end of the day, it's their life, it's their decision. They're a person too, and they have to make the decision to do whatever they're going to
mhm,
do. And all you
mhm.
can do is essentially just represent who you are and say, hey, here's what I recommend, and then let them make mistakes if they have to, which
Yeah, yeah,
sucks, but that's a
yeah.
good teacher is
It
failure.
is, it is, and I can remember. I'm kind of, my mind's kind of flashing back to some of these conversations with employees and with my kids and things, and they're looking up to you and they're looking for your guidance. Um, but they're also watching how it is that you make choices and decisions. And um, read a lot of things online, read a lot of books on personnel development, even a guy at my age, always trying to improve. Um, we all need to be very cognizant of the impact we have on people around us, those who look up to us, those who rely on us, but also those people who we rely on and learn from because they're watching who is it that we look up to.
Yep. And that's it's one of those observing things that you're like, well, I don't want them to pay attention to this part of my life.
Yeah.
And
We
it's
don't
like
get to
too
choose
bad.
that though, do we?
You don't,
No.
and but it makes you show up in every aspect, and it does
Right.
make you less I'm not going to say less fake because nobody should be fake, but it makes you more genuine more often. because you really don't have a choice about the matter. And actually, if you try to hide that, you're just going to make things worse most of the
Yeah.
time. So don't do that.
Well, that I know that's a thing I've learned from my own children. Their generation has this term authenticity.
Hmm.
Look back on my parents and aunts and uncles who are products of World War II and the Great Depression. And that's a word that never was in their vocabulary
Mm.
because they always had to have this wall up about them that I'm tough, I'm impenetrable, I'm strong, I'm not going to cry in front of you. I think leaders and dads have to understand that at some point they're going to be in a big generational difference.
Oh, that's it. Yes. And I think
Um,
that's, well, I think that's one of the reasons why, oh, well, like with you, like I don't see you as a 63-year-old or like as, okay, you're that older
I,
generation
I
because
hear
you
that a
really seem
lot.
with it. Well, you seem with it. And that's, it's kind of funny because I've been around Gen Z a bunch too. Like my younger sister, she's like 28 or whatever. So I've always been,
Mhm.
seeing them. So I think I get it a little bit more. But at the end of the day, if you want to be a stodgy, stubborn, old guy that will only look at the whole world through the lens of, I guess your primary generation, then it's going to be difficult to one connect with your younger employees and your children. But then also just adjust to the changing times, which, I think we'll have to have you back on to talk about that.
Definitely have to be adaptable. Here's the problem I've had with being adaptable as I've gotten much older and now have grandchildren. Okay. Is that there are things that change that you have to be adaptable to, such as, say, like in our industry, technology. Okay. Um, when when I was a teenager in dating, you were really careful how you dialed the phone because mom and dad in their bed could hear that you were dialing. You were calling the girlfriend.
Yeah.
Okay. And you had to have a long enough cord
To
to
hide in the
get
closet.
past the door to be okay, right? I mean, there's things you don't have to think of. You have to be adaptable. But there are certain things that we as parents and leaders shouldn't be adaptable to. There are certain ethics and morals and like being kind.
Mm,
It's timeless.
yep. Don't burn
Uh,
bridges.
yeah. Yeah. The famous saying of, be careful of the bridges you burn on the way up in your corporate world. You might have to cross them on the way back down.
Yep. Or come across them just in general. Like
Yeah.
it's a much
Yeah.
smaller world than anybody really likes to think about. Where you're like, oh, there's so many people, I'll just disappear. I'm like, man, I as a kid, you're like, well, when I'm older, this won't even matter. I won't even remember this situation. It's like, no, you remember and they remember, and it's affecting
Yeah.
things now.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is in the
Yeah.
past, but
Yeah.
I think yeah, well, I think it's just you just got to treat everything like, everything's going to be remembered because ideally it is.
So this adaptability, um, when I think of things, I tend to think of where I'm at versus where I was.
Mm.
And I can remember a conversation with my dad, he died 20 years ago. Okay. He had a really, really hard time with me being involved in my children's life
Mm.
because he was taught that your adaptation to the world is, yes, to be a good dad, but to be the provider. Okay. And My wife and I, for most of our lives, have been dual incomes.
Mm.
It was probably 10 years worth where it wasn't. And that was by our choice. But he looked at that as a weakness. Being involved in your children's lives was a weakness. You're teaching your children that you're vulnerable.
Mm.
And he couldn't take that.
Yeah.
Could not
Well,
handle that.
well, and for this, both that kind of like rigidness or just old fashioned at that point, and the stubbornness and all that kind of stuff just highlights that you have to be adjustable because you want your kids to be adjustable too. You don't want them going through a time in their life. I think it's ridiculous, even when people say, "Oh, I'm too old for that." For me, I have a practice of adapting new things into my life, like gradually. Like I always use TikTok as the example because I love TikTok. No one's going to ever convince me that's not the best social media network right now that you could be on, just in terms of the information. But I didn't just jump on it. I literally thought it was going to be canceled like 2, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. I was like, oh yeah, TikTok, it's too new, and I think it might be going away. And I don't like to invest time in things that might be going away because what's the point? And so I waited, and that made me look old fashioned for a little bit because I wasn't on TikTok. But now I'm like, then I get into it and I'm like, oh yeah, now I get it. And now I'm adapting, changing, and developing. But I still run into that all the time where people are like, TikTok's for young people or TikTok's for kids who like to dance or something. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you said the same thing about Facebook.
I never used TikTok.
TikTok, yeah, that's fine. But it has given me the ability
There,
to
you have to
learn.
be able to admit that you have weaknesses.
Yeah.
And then, therefore, you have to develop people in your business who have a strength where you're weak.
Yeah. And that takes humility to admit that you have a weakness. Because the flip side is you just say, like, no, that thing's stupid. Anybody who uses it is stupid. I don't want to do it. And so it's bad and blah, 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 blah. And then they don't let anybody else use it either, versus just accepting that that's just a thing you're not good at or maybe just not interested in. That's fine too. Don't do it. You're the boss. Like, figure
Or
it out.
you can get to a point in life where you're like, I know I need to continue to grow and adapt. But man, I just don't get this part. Okay. Um, and I tie that back to my relationships with my children. So my son, who lives in Austin, I regularly contact him. I did today,
Mm.
and I said, hey, here's something that happened on social media. It was something on LinkedIn. And I said, how would you handle that? How would you feel about it? And his feelings were very different than mine. Okay. Um, and you have to be able to, as a leader and as a parent, we all have to be able to go, I can learn from my children too. I can learn from my employees also. Hey, I've got the right person in that spot in my company because I can go to them and I can be vulnerable and I can show them that I don't know everything. I'm just in this leadership or ownership role because at some point I have to make final decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That might be budget. No, we can't spend that. Yeah, we need it, but we can't spend it. Okay. For whatever reason it might be. Or like with my son today, I was like, I'm having a hard time with this. And if you didn't do the job right all along, you can raise a child who goes, ooh, dad's weak.
Mm.
You
Yeah, I
know?
see that all the time. Yeah, see it all throughout history.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
terrible monarchies.
Yeah.
but those are the values they're raised on, and honestly, they're expressing the values that you taught them. If that does happen, because maybe you said like, the older are weak and the young must take over, and that's the thing that you told your kids the whole time. They're gonna apply that. Why would they not? They did what you said. It's like the ideal scenario. So, no, I think from every aspect, it's always good to be the three aspects that you talked about. You need what was it? Humility, you need
Humility,
confidence, and you need trust.
confidence, and trust.
And those are all, you know,
Lose
basic
one of those,
relationship.
you lost all three.
Yep. No, it's fantastic. I think that's great advice for leadership, great advice for parents, fathers especially. And I love that you started with the humility, because I talk about humility all the time, and I just think it's such a barrier not to have it, because it just means that you're
That's
right.
my weakness. That's my weakness. I have I have a hard time with that. I'm not good at it.
Hey, that's fine as long as you acknowledge
I,
that
but
and take
isn't
it
but
back.
is yeah, isn't that part of being as good a parent as you can be,
Yep,
a good a leader as you can be, is that you could admit that there's something you're probably not good at.
yep, and that's fine. Actually, that's good, because now you can get better at it, or
Mhm.
bring somebody in who's going to do a better job if it's your business, and that's fine.
Right?
That's great,
You get
fantastic.
adult children like I have, and you go, I'm going to call so and so about that.
Yep. Oh, and that's a great feeling too. Like
It
not
really
have,
is.
well, and that's the thing I always talk about, because everybody thinks that they want to be a leader, right? Like, oh, I want to be in charge. It's like, why? You're responsible for
Yeah,
everything. It's not
yeah.
fun.
You
It's
never
tough.
get to leave.
Yeah, you never get to leave, and you never get to relax. And that's the
No.
thing, that it's like, no, you go home and you could peace out. You don't have to do anything for this business if you don't want to, and it's not going to affect you at all.
Yeah.
So, but me,
Yeah.
I'm going to be in trouble, and I'm going to be held to this. And so, and that's just learning. So they got to learn that too. But
Yeah.
I think this has been fantastic. I think you've done an excellent job at both business leadership and fatherhood. That's amazing that you have your kids working for you, because I know a lot of people who do have successful businesses, and the kids either
Well,
aren't part of it because they can't stand the business or can't stand their father, and it's not an
I
ideal.
I'm going to share something with you. You can choose to leave this in or take it out. It's up to you.
All right.
Okay. Um, we were talking about how did you learn to be a leader? Well, that you had people to look up to. You can read books on it. Yeah, there's parenting books out there. But here's how I became a parent. Okay. Born and raised in this community in northwestern Iowa, 1,700 people. Okay. 30 kids in my graduating class. So my dad was on the city council. He was the largest employer. My mom was one of the surgical nurses at a hospital in the region. Okay. Prominent people. Um, I became a dad at 17.
Oh, wow, that's hard.
And when my parents found out, here's how that was handled. Tom, we're going to give you two choices. Either you're going to finish school and go on to college and never ever see your child, or get out. Now, you can take your car, go find some place to live on your own,
Hmm.
but you're out of this family.
Wow, that's a choice. Brutal.
I left
Yeah, what are you gonna do?
at age
I,
17,
well, and
lived
that
out, lived out of my car, finished high school, lived with my girlfriend for part of that. Her
wow,
family took me in.
yeah,
So the reason I bring that up is because I think there's moments in time that really shape us. I could have been bitter. I could have been angry. Nope. I brought this child into the world. No idea what to do about it. You can about imagine what I could get for a job summer before my senior year in high school. um, but I've never forgotten that moment. I've never allowed it to make me bitter, but it greatly shaped my empathy for employees when they have tough times.
Mm.
It greatly shaped who my children dated. Not that I ever made that choice. That's not what I'm saying. But it made sure that I tried my best to teach them, here's some obstacles that can happen in life. Here's what happened to your dad. They know all of it. They knew all of it at a young age. So much so that one of the moments I can remember, they were bathing with their cousin, and one of their cousins came out of the bathtub screaming, saying, "My cousin told me that babies come from down here," at like age 10,
Oh my gosh.
because they knew.
Yeah.
They knew.
No, and I think that's huge. And honestly, the people I feel the worst for in that story are probably your parents, because I mean, I see, it's back when you're younger, you think like, yeah, that makes sense. And then now I'm older and I have kids, and I'm like, no, I would never abandon my children for
Yeah,
any
I can
reason that
never
they.
imagine abandoning my child in a time like that.
in
You
a
know,
in a really rough situation. I'm just like, no. And there's, I'm hope that you have a good relationship with them, but it's a huge loss for them, and that sucks. And that situation, it's not definitely not temporary because you have kids and that's forever. But the handling of it is just remembered to this day, and it's
yeah,
unfortunate. So I
and
I,
it,
I
and
actually
it
make
was,
decisions like that now too, where I'm like, you know what, me having this one interaction is like could be a pivotal moment for my son, and so I better not screw it up, because you can. Well,
so
that's
that balance between your children and your employees of being approachable, uh, being having a sense of humility, and showing that you're confident and visionary in making decisions.
changes
Those are
everything.
those are tough
They are.
because they
Well,
can swing either direction. And when you make the decision,
and the thing is, it's like
it can
you'll
stick
make
with you
wrong.
your whole life.
Well, and you'll make the wrong decision sometimes, but if the person that decision affected knew that no matter what, even if it was the wrong decision, you had their best interests in mind. Like at the end of the day, I made this decision. I thought it was in your best interest, even if it wasn't. That
Yeah.
understanding is really what matters. Like, hey, I did this thing. Hey, well, even for your parents, like we did that, we gave you that option because we felt like it was the best way to help you move forward. And we're idiots. That's all I could think of, because I'm like, what? I'm helping my kid out. I don't
Yeah.
even want him to know how much I'll help him out if he really needed it.
Yeah. So I think even the people that we learn about life from, such as my parents, even though in reflection I didn't agree with their decisions or the way they handled it, um, I understand why they did.
Mm,
It was their upbringing. It was their experience. It was because of what they'd seen happen. Um,
yeah, I mean, it could have happened in their family, or like both my parents, they have know, 8 to 10 siblings. And so back then, if it was, yeah, you're taking care of a farm, like you just, we have to let you go, because if we don't, then we're all going to starve to death. Like that was a real
Yep.
situation at some point in history.
Yep.
It's like,
Yep.
no, it's not that bad now. You can
Back
figure it
in
out.
back in that day, I know my grandparents used to talk about that they were thankful they had a lot of boys
Hmm.
because they needed help around the
They're
farm.
workers, yeah. No, that's why people had, or half of the kids didn't
One reason
survive.
to have children was to have helpers.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, I think we just have to be thankful that that's not the case. We could
Yeah.
live and
Yeah.
have kids and support
Yeah.
them and do everything, and it's great. Well,
Work
thank
while
you so
you're on
much.
vacation.
I know
You
that's
bet.
actually, I think every one of the episodes, right? The last episode, the one I posted with Aton, I was in Laguna and he was actually in Colorado or something, and so it's just been Dad's on Vacation podcast. So you're continuing the trend, and I appreciate it. But
You
thank you so
bet.
much. Those are fantastic points. I think it's really important for dads especially to hear this, that all those principles are universal, and a lot of the things that you practice on a daily basis you can practice in your home too, or vice versa, where it's like, hey,
Right. That's right.
you treat your kids with empathy, you treat your employees with empathy, you give them structure and responsibility and objectives and motivation, and you give your employees all those things too. And I think you're an example of what it leads to, which is a successful business, happy kids that talk to you and trust you enough to bring hard issues to you if they have them. That's win. You're successful.
Most of the time.
That's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, but you've accomplished a ton, and I think that's super admirable.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for having me on. Be happy to do this more often.
Yes. Yeah. I think next time, I think before the show, we kind of talked about like, hey, we should really talk about the changes happening because the whole world seems like it's on fire.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll definitely have you back on soon. We'll discuss that and talk more parenting and leadership, because that's the same thing. Thank you,
Cool.
Thomas.
Hey, have a great vacation. Hugs to the family.
Thank you so much. And thank you for
You bet.
listening. This has been Podcast Mark. Appreciate your time, and come back for more leadership, business, marketing, AI, and anything else you feel like talking about when I have my friends on the show.